The first hard frost came early that year, settling over the valley like a warning. By mid-October, the mornings already carried that particular bite that told you winter wasn't just coming, it was already sharpening its teeth. Up on the ridge where the cabin sat surrounded by second-growth pine and the occasional defiant birch, the man who lived there stood in his yard with a pencil behind his ear and a measuring tape in his hand, studying the structure he'd called home for the better part of a decade. The cabin itself was solid enough. Not much to look at, maybe, but the logs were good and tight, the chinking held, and the roof didn't leak more than a trickle in the heaviest downpours. It was 20 feet by 24, with a sleeping loft accessed by a ladder and a wood stove that had seen better days, but still threw heat like a forge when you fed it right. The real problem, the problem that had dogged him through 3 winters already, was the wood. Not the lack of it. He had 5 cords stacked and split with another 2 in rounds waiting for the axe. The problem was keeping it dry. Every winter played out the same way. He'd stack the wood carefully under tarps, weighted down with rocks and scrap lumber, arranged so water would supposedly run off. And every winter, by January, he'd be splitting frozen logs slick with ice, wrestling damp wood into the stove, watching it hiss and smoke and burn half-hearted while the cold crept through the floorboards. Wet wood meant more work, more smoke, less heat. It meant waking at 3 in the morning to a stove gone cold, because the overnight logs had been too damp to hold a coal. It meant that constant background anxiety of wondering if you had enough dry stuff to get through the next storm. So he'd spent the summer thinking, watching how the weather moved across his property, where the snow drifted deepest, where the wind hit hardest, and somewhere around July, splitting rounds in the heat with sweat running down his back, the idea had crystallized. If he couldn't keep the weather off the wood, he'd keep the wood away from the weather entirely. He'd build a structure, a shed, essentially, that wrapped around the entire north and west sides of the cabin, creating a covered zone between the cabin wall and the outer shell. The wood would live in that protected space under a roof out of the wind, with air moving through it but rain and snow kept at bay. When he mentioned it to the neighbors, the couple who lived 2 miles down the valley road, the old-timer with the dairy herd, the woman who ran the general store in town, the response was universal. They smiled. They nodded. They thought he was out of his mind. "You're gonna wrap your cabin in a shed?" the dairy farmer had said, not unkindly, but with the sort of tone you'd use on someone who'd announced they were going to teach raccoons to square dance. "That's a hell of a lot of lumber just to keep some firewood dry." The woman from the store had been more direct. "Sounds like a good way to trap moisture against your cabin walls and rot the whole thing out by spring." Even the couple down valley, who were generally supportive of unconventional thinking, had exchanged one of those looks, the kind that said they'd be telling this story at dinner parties for years. But he'd done the math. The lumber would cost him, sure, but he'd been scrounging materials all summer from demolition sites. Old barns being torn down, a neighbor's pole shed that had collapsed under snow the previous winter. He had enough to make it work. More than that, he had the conviction that comes from 3 winters of frozen fingers and smoke-filled mornings, and the particular exhaustion that settles into your bones when you're burning damp wood, day after day after day. The design came together on paper first, sketched on the back of feed store receipts and old grocery lists. The shed would run along the cabin's north wall, the side that took the worst of the winter wind, and wrap around the west end where the snow tended to pile deepest. 12 feet deep from the cabin wall to the outer posts, which would give him plenty of room to stack wood in rows, with airspace between. The roof would be simple, a shed pitch sloping away from the cabin, built from 2x6 rafters on 24-inch centers with metal roofing he'd pulled from that collapsed pole shed. Nothing fancy, but solid. The key was ventilation. He'd leave the south side completely open except for the posts, and the east end would be gapped too, creating a cross breeze that would keep air moving through the wood without letting rain or snow blast directly in. He started the first week of September when the days were still warm enough to work comfortably, but the nights carried that edge that reminded you time was short. First came the posts. 6x6 pressure-treated timbers he'd salvaged from an old deck project, sunk 3 feet into the ground and set in concrete made from bags he mixed by hand in a wheelbarrow. 8 posts in all, forming the outer corners and supporting the middle span. He set them with a 4-foot level and a string line, checking and rechecking until they stood plumb and true. The ground was still soft enough to dig, but he could feel it starting to harden as the first frosts came at night, and he worked with the awareness that once the ground froze solid, any mistake would be locked in until spring. With the posts set and the concrete cured, he built the beam that would carry the outer edge of the roof, a doubled 2x8 bolted to the top of the posts, creating a continuous header that ran the full length of the structure. The cabin wall itself would carry the high side of the roof, so he through-bolted a ledger board directly to the logs, sealing each bolt hole with tar to keep water from wicking into the wood. The work was methodical, repetitive, the kind of building that doesn't require genius but rewards care. Measure twice, cut once, check for level, drive the nails home. The rafters went up over the course of a week, each one cut to length with the circular saw, the whine of the motor echoing off the hills. He set them on 16-inch centers, closer than the plan called for, but he'd seen what 2 feet of heavy wet snow could do to a roof that wasn't built stout, and he had the lumber, so why not? Each rafter notched onto the ledger board and the beam, tied down with hurricane clips he'd picked up at the hardware store in town. The clerk had raised an eyebrow at the quantity, but hadn't asked questions. People up here learned not to question other people's projects too closely. You did what you thought you needed to do, and if it worked, you were smart. If it didn't, well, that was a learning experience. The metal roofing went on in October as the aspens down in the valley started to turn. He'd never worked with metal before, had always been a shingles man, but the sheets were light enough to handle alone and fast to install once he got the rhythm of it. Each panel overlapped the one below, fastened with screws driven into the rafters, a neoprene washer under each screw head to seal against leaks. The sound of the impact driver echoed off the cabin walls as he worked, a steady mechanical chirp that seemed to answer the jays scolding from the pines. The roof took shape panel by panel, silver gray in the autumn light, and when the last piece was screwed down, he stood back and looked at what he'd made. A long, low overhang that turned the north side of his cabin into something that looked half barn, half fortress. The south side, as planned, stayed open. Just the posts and the beam overhead. Nothing to block the prevailing summer wind or the sun that would help dry the wood during the shoulder seasons. But he added a few refinements as he worked. Horizontal nailers between the posts at waist height and again at knee height, creating a framework he could use to stack the wood against, keeping it organized and stable. He left 6-inch gaps between the bottom nailer and the ground, propping it on concrete blocks so air could flow underneath. Moisture rises, he knew that. If the bottom row of wood sat directly on earth, it would wick water up through the end grain and rot from the bottom no matter how good the roof was. The west end, where the shed wrapped around the corner, got more attention. This was the side that would catch the worst of the wind-driven snow, and he wanted it protected but not sealed. He framed it with horizontal slats spaced 4 inches apart, angled slightly downward so snow would shed off but air could still move through. It wasn't a wall so much as a baffle, enough to break the force of a storm without creating a dead air pocket where moisture would hang and never leave. He used rough-cut pine for the slats, gray and weathered boards pulled from a shed he'd dismantled earlier in the summer. They gave the structure a patchwork look, but they worked, and that was what mattered. By the time the first snow flew, a light dusting in late October that melted by noon, the structure was finished. He spent a day moving wood, stacking it in rows inside the new space, working methodically from the back to the front. The oldest wood, split 2 summers ago and dry as bone, went in first, closest to the cabin door. Then the wood from last winter, good and seasoned. Finally, the stuff he'd split in the spring, still carrying some moisture but with a winter under a roof to finish drying. He stacked it bark side up where it mattered, tilted the rows slightly forward so water would run off instead of pooling, and left deliberate gaps between each row, 3 inches, 4 inches, enough for air to move freely through the stacks. When it was done, he had close to 4 cords under cover, with room for another cord if he needed it. The wood sat in neat rows like books on a shelf, and when he walked through the space between the cabin wall and the outer edge, the difference was immediate. It felt dry, protected. The wind that rattled the pine boughs overhead seemed distant, muffled by the overhang and the stacks of wood themselves. He reached out and touched a piece of ash he'd split in June, ran his hand along the end grain, feeling for moisture, and it was dry, absolutely dry, the wood almost chalky under his fingers. The neighbors came by one afternoon in early November, the dairy farmer and his son, ostensibly to borrow a chainsaw, but really, he suspected, to see what the crazy hermit had actually built. They walked around the structure slowly, the old man running his hand along the posts, peering up at the roof, studying the ventilation gaps. "Well," he said finally, "it's different." The son, who was maybe 19 and full of the kind of confidence that comes from never having been truly cold, just shook his head. "Seems like a lot of work. I just throw a tarp over my woodpile and call it good." The man who lived in the cabin didn't argue. There wasn't any point. Winter would do the talking. The first real test came 3 weeks later. A low-pressure system swept down from Canada, temperatures dropping from the 40s to the teens in the span of 6 hours. And then the snow started. Not the light, pretty snow of late autumn. This was the heavy, wet, wind-driven stuff that piled up fast and stuck to everything. It fell for 2 days straight, accumulating in drifts that buried fence posts and turned the county road into a single-lane track. The wind howled out of the northwest, gusting to 40-50 miles an hour, driving the snow sideways and packing it into every crack and crevice. He stayed inside for the worst of it, feeding the stove every few hours, listening to the wind scream around the cabin. On the afternoon of the second day, when the snow finally stopped and the sky cleared to a hard, brilliant blue, he pulled on his boots and parka and went outside to assess the damage. The world was transformed, white and silent and sparkling in the low sun, the kind of beauty that stops your breath right up until you remember you have to live in it. The shed had disappeared under snow on the windward side, drifts piled 3 feet high against the slatted west end, but the roof had held. More than that, it had worked exactly as designed. The snow had hit the overhang and slid off or piled up on top, but inside, in the space between the cabin and the outer edge, the wood was untouched. Dry. He walked the length of the structure, checking stack by stack, and found maybe a dusting of fine snow that had blown in through the south side. Nothing that wouldn't sublimate off in a day or two of dry air. The ventilation gaps he'd left had done their job. Air had moved through during the storm, preventing the kind of pressure buildup that could tear a roof off, but the wood had stayed protected. His neighbors hadn't been so lucky. He heard about it when he snowshoed down to the general store a few days later, trading small talk with the woman who ran the register while he picked up coffee and kerosene. The couple down valley had lost a tarp in the wind, she said, and spent half the storm chasing it across their property before giving up. The dairy farmer's son had had his entire woodpile buried and was now digging it out by hand, one frozen piece at a time. "He was up here yesterday buying dicer," the woman said, shaking her head. "Said he's been trying to get his stove lit for 2 days, but everything's too wet to burn." She looked at him with something that might have been new respect. "How's your wood holding up?" He just smiled. "Dry as summer." But he'd be lying if he said everything was perfect. The structure had done its job in the first storm, but as November turned to December and the winter settled in with real authority, problems started to show themselves. The first issue was ice, meltwater from the roof, running off during the brief warm spells when the sun hit the metal and temperatures climbed above freezing, would drip off the edge and freeze overnight, forming icicles that grew longer and thicker with each cycle. Some of them got massive, 2 feet long and thick as a man's wrist, hanging like teeth from the outer edge. They were beautiful in their way, catching the light like crystal, but they were also dangerous and, more importantly, a sign that water was moving in ways he hadn't fully anticipated. He spent a morning knocking them down with a long pole, then studied the problem. The issue was the metal roofing. It conducted heat from inside the cabin, warming the underside just enough to melt snow during the day, even when the ambient temperature stayed below freezing. The melt would run down the roof and refreeze at the edge, creating ice dams that could, over time, back up under the panels and leak into the wood storage below. The solution was insulation, but he was months too late for that. You couldn't insulate from underneath in winter, not without taking the whole roof apart, and that wasn't happening until spring. Instead, he improvised. He took a length of heat tape, The electrical kind used to keep water pipes from freezing, and ran it along the outer edge of the roof, zigzagging back and forth along the drip edge and plugging it into an extension cord that ran back to the cabin. It wasn't elegant and it added to his power bill, but it worked. The heat tape kept the edge warm enough to prevent ice dams from forming, and the meltwater now dripped cleanly off instead of freezing in place. He only ran it during the day when the sun was on the roof, turning it off at night to save electricity, and within a week, the icicle problem was solved. The second issue was more insidious: condensation. On the coldest nights, and there were plenty of them, the thermometer dropping to 0 to 10 below to 20 below, moisture from his breath and cooking, and just the act of being alive would condense on the inside of the cabin's log walls. Normally, this wasn't a huge problem. The logs would soak it up during the day when the stove was running hot and the cabin warmed, and the moisture would gradually work its way out through the chinking and gaps. But now, with the shed structure tight against the north wall, that side of the cabin didn't get the same air circulation. The logs stayed colder on the outside, and the moisture didn't have anywhere to go. He noticed it first as a slight sheen on the logs near the stove. Nothing alarming, just a dampness that didn't seem to dry as quickly as it should. Then, in mid-December, he spotted the beginning of mold, a faint gray shadow in the corner where the wall met the floor. It stopped him cold. Mold in winter was rare. The air was usually too dry. But he'd created an artificial microclimate, and now he was seeing the consequences. The fix required surgery. He took a drill and bored a series of 2-inch holes through the cabin wall at floor level, spacing them every 4 feet along the length of the shed. Then he did the same at ceiling height, just below the roofline. The holes gave the wall a chance to breathe. Cold air would flow in through the bottom, warm air would rise and escape through the top, creating a gentle convection current inside the space between the cabin wall and the wood piles. It was basic building science, the same principle used in any ventilated attic, but he'd overlooked it in his focus on keeping the wood dry. He covered the holes with hardware cloth to keep mice out, and within a week the difference was noticeable. The sheen on the logs faded. The air in the shed space smelled fresher, less stagnant. The mold stopped spreading. Didn't go away entirely. He'd deal with that in spring, but it didn't get worse. And the wood kept drying. Even the pieces he'd split late in the summer, the ones that had still been a little green when he'd stacked them, were hardening and checking, the splits opening up as the moisture worked its way out into the moving air. By Christmas, the system had settled into equilibrium. The shed did what he'd built it to do, and he'd debugged the problems that came with any new design. The work became routine. Wake at dawn, when the cabin was coldest, still carrying the chill of the long night. Stir the coals in the stove. Add a few pieces of kindling, then a couple of larger splits once the fire caught. Pull on boots and a jacket and step outside into the blue-dark cold to grab an armload of wood from the stacks, always working from the oldest pile first, always replacing what you took so the stacks stayed organized. Carry the wood inside. Stack it beside the stove to warm while you made coffee and oatmeal. Feed the fire through the morning as you did whatever work needed doing. Hauling water, checking snares, reading, thinking, the 1,000 small tasks that fill a day when you live alone in the woods. The rhythm of it became meditative. The cabin stayed warm, truly warm, not the barely adequate heat you got from burning damp wood, because every piece that went into the stove was dry and seasoned. The fires burned clean and hot, the stovepipe glowing cherry red on the coldest nights, and the warmth sank into the log walls and the floor and the loft, holding there even when the fire burned down to coals. He wasn't constantly adjusting the draft or adding wood every hour to compensate for wet fuel. Once he had a good coal bed established, he could load the stove full, damper it down, and get 6, 7, sometimes 8 hours of steady heat. He slept through the night for the first time in winters, not waking to feed the fire, not startled awake by the crack of contracting metal as the stove cooled too fast. And the wood lasted. By mid-January, when he'd normally be halfway through his winter supply and starting to ration, he'd burned maybe 1.5 cords. The difference was efficiency. Dry wood burns hotter and faster but releases more energy per piece, so you actually use less of it to produce the same heat. He did the math in his head one morning while drinking coffee and watching snow fall outside the window. At this rate, he'd finish the winter with 1 cord to spare. maybe more. That was wood he could leave to season for another year. Wood that would be absolutely bone dry by next winter, giving him a buffer he'd never had before. The neighbors noticed. Not directly. They didn't come by to check on him, didn't ask pointed questions, but word travels in small communities, and the general store is where it travels to. He heard the stories secondhand. The dairy farmer's son had gone through his entire woodpile by February and was now burning green wood he'd cut in desperation, spending half his time dealing with creosote buildup in his chimney. The couple down valley had given up and installed a propane heater, which worked but cost them a fortune in gas deliveries. Even the old dairy farmer himself, who'd been burning wood for 50 years and thought he knew every trick, admitted that his wood hadn't stayed as dry as he'd hoped, and he was having to mix in coal to keep his farmhouse warm. Nobody said, "You were right." That wasn't how it worked. But when he saw the dairy farmer in town one afternoon in early February, the old man looked at him for a long moment and then nodded. Just once. The kind of nod that carries weight. "That shed setup of yours," he said finally. "Might have to think about something like that myself." It was as close to an apology as he was likely to get, and he took it as such. February brought the deep cold, the kind that settles in for weeks at a time and doesn't let go. The thermometer stopped climbing above zero most days, and at night it would plunge to 20, 30, even 40 below. The cold so intense it felt like a physical presence pressing against the cabin walls. Those were the nights when you appreciated good design. The shed kept the wood protected from the wind-driven snow that scoured across the ridge, and the firewood inside stayed dry and ready. He'd step outside in the morning darkness, the sun not rising until well after 8, and the cold would hit him like a wall, but the walk to the shed was short, and the wood was right there, stacked and waiting. He developed a routine for the coldest stretches. In the evening, before the temperature really dropped, he'd bring in enough wood to last through the night and into the next morning. A dozen pieces, maybe 15, stacked beside the stove where they'd stay room temperature instead of freezing outside. Not so much that they'd crowd the cabin, but enough that he wouldn't have to make multiple trips in the pre-dawn cold. He'd load the stove before bed, filling it completely with the biggest pieces that would fit, then damper it down to a slow, steady burn. The goal was to keep the fire alive through the night without it raging so hot it burned out in 3 hours. On the coldest nights, the ones where the thermometer read -30 or worse, he'd wake once, usually around 3, and add a few pieces to keep things going. It wasn't strictly necessary. The cabin would stay above freezing even if the fire went out. But he'd learned that it was easier to maintain heat than to rebuild it from scratch at dawn. Those middle-of-the-night moments had their own quality. The cabin dark except for the glow when he opened the stove door. The fire inside pulsing red and orange, the new wood catching with a soft whoosh. Then back to bed, the warmth spreading, and sleep again until proper morning. The shed proved its worth in other ways too. Because the wood stayed dry and clean, there was less mess. No bark falling off frozen logs and littering the floor, no ice chips melting into puddles, no muddy boot prints from trudging through snow to uncover a tarp-covered pile. The space inside the shed became almost like another room. Not heated, obviously, but protected. A transitional zone between the brutal outside and the warm interior. He found himself using it for storage beyond just firewood. Tools that didn't need to be inside but shouldn't be left exposed to the weather. The spare axe, the splitting maul, boxes of kindling he'd made on rainy autumn days. It became a workspace too. On days when the weather was too harsh to be fully outside but he needed to do something with his hands, he'd stand in the shed space and split kindling or sharpen the chainsaw or just putter around organizing things, and it was comfortable enough. Cold, certainly, but out of the wind and away from the snow. March arrived with the first hints of change. The sun climbed higher each day, and on the south-facing slopes the snow started to pull back in patches, revealing frozen grass and bare earth. But the real cold wasn't done. Spring was still weeks away, and the March storms were often the worst of the season, wet and heavy and difficult. He watched the weather move in off the Pacific, system after system, each one bringing a mix of snow and sleet and freezing rain that coated everything in ice. This was when the shed design really mattered. The metal roof shed ice beautifully. When the sun came out after a storm, the ice would melt just enough to lose its grip, and then entire sheets of it would slide off with a sound like thunder, crashing to the ground outside the wood storage area. The wood itself, protected by the overhang, stayed dry even when freezing rain turned the rest of the world into a skating rink. He'd look out at the iced-over trees, their branches bent under the weight, and then walk into the shed and run his hand along a piece of oak, feeling the dry, solid grain, and feel something like satisfaction. The neighbors were starting to run out of wood. He heard about it first from the woman at the general store. The couple down valley had asked if she knew anyone selling firewood, willing to pay premium prices for seasoned stuff. The dairy farmer's son had switched almost entirely to coal, which kept his house warm but cost him more than he'd planned for the winter. Even people who'd thought they'd cut enough wood were finding themselves short, their calculations thrown off by burning wet fuel that didn't produce the heat they'd expected. He could have offered to sell some of his surplus. He had it, after all. A cord, maybe a cord and a half that he wouldn't burn through at this rate. But something stopped him. Not meanness exactly, but a sense that this was a lesson people needed to learn firsthand. Help a man once and he'll be grateful. Help him every time he makes the same mistake and he'll resent you for it. So he kept his wood and his own counsel, and let the winter play out as it would. April brought the thaw, not all at once, but in fits and starts. Warm days followed by hard freezes, the snow compacting and turning granular, the sound of water running everywhere as the accumulated winter began to melt. This was the test he'd been waiting for, the one that would prove whether the shed design was truly sound. Because while keeping wood dry during snowfall was important, keeping it dry during the melt was critical. All that snow piled on roofs and stacked in drifts had to go somewhere, and if your wood storage wasn't designed to handle the resulting water, you'd end up with soaked logs just as spring arrived. The shed passed. The roof pitch he'd built was steep enough that meltwater ran off quickly, channeled to the outer edge where it dripped harmlessly onto ground that sloped away from the foundation. The gaps at ground level that he'd left for ventilation also served as drainage, letting water flow through rather than pooling at the base of the woodpiles. He'd been meticulous about grading during construction, making sure everything sloped away from the cabin, and now he saw why it mattered. His neighbors, the ones who'd just thrown tarps over their woodpiles, were dealing with lakes of meltwater that had nowhere to go, seeping into the bottom rows of their wood and rendering it useless just when they needed it most. By mid-April, the worst was over. The snow was gone except for a few stubborn patches in the deepest shade, and the days were warm enough that he didn't need the fire except in the evenings. He took stock one morning, walking through the shed and counting what remained. 2 cords, give or take a few pieces. He'd burned just over 3 cords to heat the cabin through 6 months of winter, and the wood he had left was dry, clean, and ready to start seasoning for next year. The difference from previous winters was stark. He'd normally have burned 4.5, maybe 5 cords, often cutting into wood that wasn't fully seasoned because he'd run through his dry stock too quickly. The neighbors came by one afternoon in late April, not just one but several of them. The dairy farmer and his son, the couple from down valley, even a few people he didn't know well, folks from farther afield who'd heard about the shed project and wanted to see it for themselves. They walked around the structure asking questions. How much had it cost? How long had it taken to build? Did he have plans they could look at? The dairy farmer's son, who'd been so dismissive back in September, was particularly interested in the ventilation system. I didn't think about airflow, he admitted. Just figured dry wood was dry wood and that was that. The man who'd built the shed just nodded. It's always the stuff you don't think about that gets you. They talked for a while, standing in the yard as the afternoon sun warmed the mud and the first leaves began to show on the aspens. He explained the principles, not lecturing, just sharing what he'd learned, and they listened. How you needed to think about the wood, not just as fuel, but as something that had to stay dry for months at a time. How water moved and where it went. How air circulation wasn't just a nice-to-have but essential. How you could overbuild, sure, but you could also underbuild, and finding the right balance meant understanding what you were protecting against and what you could let slide. Before they left, the dairy farmer asked if he'd consider helping with a similar project on his property. Not building it for him, but consulting, offering advice on the design. He thought about it for a moment, then agreed. Not for money, though the farmer offered. Just because it seemed like the right thing to do, and because building things and solving problems was what he did anyway, and doing it with someone else might make the next winter easier for both of them. Summer came, and with it the work of preparing for the next cycle. He spent June and July cutting and splitting next year's wood, working in the early mornings before the heat of the day. The shed made the work easier. He could stack the fresh split rounds directly into the empty spaces where he'd burned wood through the winter, knowing they'd have months to dry in the protected, ventilated space. By August, the shed was full again, 5 cords stacked in neat rows, the oldest wood at the front ready for next winter's first fires, the newest at the back where it would season through the fall and winter. He made improvements as he worked. The heat tape had been a Band-Aid solution, so he added rigid foam insulation to the underside of the roof, cutting panels to fit between the rafters and sealing the edges with expanding foam. It was hot, miserable work standing on a ladder in the summer sun, but by the time he was done, the shed had an insulated lid that would prevent the melt-freeze cycle that had caused the ice dams. He reinforced a few of the horizontal nailers that had started to sag under the weight of stacked wood, added another row of ventilation holes along the west end, where he'd noticed the air wasn't moving quite as freely as he'd like, and replaced a section of hardware cloth that mice had chewed through during the winter. The dairy farmer built his own version, a simpler design but based on the same principles, and by autumn it was finished. A long, open-sided structure on the south end of his barn where he could stack 6 cords with room to spare. "You were right about the airflow," he told the man from the cabin when they met in town one afternoon. "I've never had wood dry this well this fast." The couple down valley hadn't built anything yet, but they'd stopped using tarps and had started stacking their wood off the ground on pallets, with a simple gabled roof overhead. It wasn't as sophisticated, but it was better than what they'd had. The second winter was easier than the first, not just because the shed was proven, but because he knew what to expect. The ice dams didn't form thanks to the insulation. The ventilation kept condensation from building up on the cabin walls. The wood stayed dry through every storm, every cold snap, every thaw and freeze cycle. He burned 3 cords again, maybe a little less, and by March he had more wood left over than he'd started with the previous year. The surplus was starting to accumulate. Wood that would be 2 years seasoned, then 3 years, becoming harder and denser and more heat efficient with each passing season. Other people in the area started building similar structures. Not everyone and not the exact design, but the idea spread. Protect your wood, let it breathe. Build something solid instead of relying on tarps and luck. The general store started carrying more of the materials people needed: hardware cloth, metal roofing, pressure-treated posts. The woman who ran it mentioned to him one day that she'd had more people asking about firewood storage solutions in the past year than in the previous decade. "You started something," she said, not accusingly, just observing. He didn't know if that was true. Maybe the idea had been circulating anyway, and his project had just coincided with people being ready to try something different. Or maybe he had started something. Either way, it didn't matter much. What mattered was that the system worked, that he could walk into the shed on the coldest day of winter and find dry wood waiting, that he could feed his stove without worry, knowing the fire would burn clean and hot, that he slept through the night and woke to a warm cabin and didn't spend his winters in that low-grade state of anxiety that comes from never quite knowing if you'll have enough, if it'll be dry enough, if you'll make it through. The third winter confirmed what he already knew. The shed had become part of the landscape, weathering into the same gray-brown as the cabin itself, the metal roof oxidizing to a dull matte that didn't reflect light the way it had when it was new. The wood inside went through its cycles, stacked in summer, dried through fall, burned through winter, replaced the next summer. He was ahead now, always starting each winter with more wood than he'd need, the security of surplus allowing him to relax in ways he hadn't been able to before. If a storm kept him inside for a week, it didn't matter. If he wanted to burn the stove hot on a whim, just because it felt good, he could do it without calculating how much wood he had left. The neighbors stopped laughing. They'd never laughed to his face, of course, but he'd heard the skepticism in their voices, seen the doubt in their eyes. That was gone now, replaced with something that looked like respect, or at least acknowledgement. The dairy farmer had expanded his own shed, adding a second section for his son's place. The couple down valley had finally built something permanent, a proper structure with a roof and sides and ventilation. Even the woman from the general store had mentioned she was thinking about doing something similar at her house in town, tired of buying overpriced wood from dealers who promised it was seasoned, but rarely was. The man who lived in the cabin didn't talk about it much. It was just part of his life now, as ordinary as splitting wood or hauling water or any of the other tasks that filled his days. But on cold nights, when the stove was burning steady and the cabin was warm and he could hear the wind howling outside but couldn't feel it, he'd sit with a cup of coffee or sometimes something stronger and let himself feel satisfied. Not proud, exactly. Pride seemed like the wrong word for something so practical, but satisfied. He'd seen a problem, thought it through, and built a solution that worked. And in doing so, he'd made his life measurably better in ways that compounded over time. That, in the end, was the point. Not to prove anyone wrong or to show how clever he was, but to solve the problem of staying warm through winter without fighting a losing battle against wet wood and harsh weather. The shed was ugly in some ways, beautiful in others, and entirely functional. It kept the wood dry, it kept him warm, and when the storms came and the temperatures dropped and winter showed its teeth, he could stand in his cabin and know he was ready, that he'd done the work in summer and fall that made winter survivable. The lesson, if there was one, wasn't complicated. Prepare well, build solid, think through what might go wrong and plan for it. Don't assume that the way things have always been done is the only way or the best way. Be willing to try something different even if people think you're crazy, especially if you've thought it through and believe it'll work. And when it does work, when the idea you had turns out to be sound and the thing you built does what you built it to do, don't gloat, just keep going. There's always another winter coming. So if you're out there struggling with wet wood or burning through your supply faster than you planned or waking up at 3 a.m. to a cold stove and no dry kindling, maybe it's time to think differently about how you store your fuel. It doesn't have to be a full wraparound shed. Maybe that's overkill for your situation. But the principles hold. Keep it dry, keep air moving through it, protect it from the weather, but don't seal it up so tight that moisture can't escape. Build something that'll last, even if it takes all summer, because the winters are long and cold and you'll use that firewood storage every single day for months. And if you found this useful, if it got you thinking about your own setup or made you realize there might be a better way to do things, do me a favor. Subscribe to the channel, hit that notification bell, because I'm going to keep documenting what works up here in the woods. The projects that succeed, the mistakes that teach you something, the practical solutions to the problems that come with living this way. Not theory, not speculation, but the stuff that gets tested every single winter when the temperature drops and the snow piles up and you need your systems to work because there's no backup plan, no safety net, just you and what you've built, and whether it'll hold up when it matters. So subscribe, join me, and let's figure out together how to live well in places where winter isn't just a season. It's a test you have to pass every single year. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.